I'm really privileged to be able to convene our lunch entertainment, as it were, which is a conversation with the esteemed Wade Henderson. I don't know how you introduce an icon. You're a
Please.
gentleman, a jurist. No, but Wade was a transformational CEO for the Leadership Conference on Human and Civil Rights, one of the most important, historically important civil rights organizations in this country. Before that, had an equally legendary tenure running the Washington bureau of the NAACP, and before that at the ACLU. I don't know if that was a legendary tenure, but
No,
it launched you to
but it
great
was
things.
wonderful.
Um, and we're just going to take a little bit of time to talk about um, what it means to pursue change that is decadal in the context of our policy processes and structures. So, um, Wade, I wanted to start actually on a biographical note,
Yeah.
which is just asking you, how did you get into the work of civil rights advocacy? What led you into the
Yeah.
movement and into the part of the movement that really defined your career?
Wow. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Honored to be here. And before I say anything, Sam, let me congratulate the Duke Foundation for this convening. I think it's really important. I think the conversation has been rich, and I congratulate you and your colleagues for making it happen. I'm a native Washingtonian. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I had a pretty uneventful childhood. I won't dwell on that. But when I turned 15 in 1963, I experienced, for me, an epiphany, a set of changes that had such a profound impact on me. It sent me in the direction that I am today. It began with the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama, when 5,000 kids were marched downtown to express their dissatisfaction with segregation and were set upon by dogs and hoses of the local sheriff. And that, shocked the conscience, and it shocked me. I also was affected by Medgar Evers' assassination. And I had been involved in the local NAACP. My parents had been involved when he was killed. That had a real impact on my perspective. The March on Washington was transformative for me. I went to the March on Washington. I was 15 years old. As my grandmother would say, I was sort of smelling myself. And, she felt that, look, I needed to go. I went, sort of defied my parents' wishes at the time, but it was good. And I rode my bike, and it was a profound experience. I don't remember what Dr. King said, but I remember how he made me feel and how the audience responded to him and how I responded to the audience. I had a great impact. And then lastly, the murder of the 4 young girls in the Birmingham church in September of that same year had a profound impact on me. So I grew up in the 1960s. It was a time of change, but that for me was a real epiphany. It pushed me in the direction of civil rights advocacy. I was committed to making change. And one last experience. I was insulated from the horrors of segregation in that I didn't have the problems of kids in Birmingham or Montgomery or lots of other places. But I did experience what I thought were the dehumanizing effects of segregation in a way that had a real impact on me. And it involved a clothing store that I went to buy a suit for my graduation from middle school, had my own money. I'd worked, saved up, went in, picked out the suit. My parents said, you can't buy anything you can't try on. And when I went to try it on, I was humiliated by the salesman who said, well, Negroes can't try on clothes here at Garfinkel's. And he laughed. And the entire floor seemed to burst into laughter. And I was so freaked. I ran out of the store. I was angry with myself as much as I was that entire system. And that system of dehumanization, for me, summed up what segregation was all about and really moved me in the direction that I pursued, both in college and subsequently in law school. So that's really the short story of how I got to where I am.
All right, and let's sort of use that to get into the core topic, which is that the moments like Dr. King's speech at the March on Washington, it can, in retrospect, it can be easy to feel like the world was one way, we had that moment, and then we moved to the next chapter,
Yeah.
and almost sort of like Lyndon Johnson's speech on the floor of Congress before the Voting Rights Act. That's, sometimes time and space come together, history comes together in one time and space. But that isn't how change happens, right? Those moments are really important. They're compression points that can change a life. They're compression points that can change the trajectory of an issue. But it really launched you on a career of the blocking and tackling, of doing the hard
Yes.
decadal work that includes winning and losing,
Yes.
advances and setbacks. What, maybe let's start with an example or two of changes that we see, that we now take for granted as being part of the sort of the essential fabric of a society that we hope is becoming more just, or as an indication of what a more just society is, and maybe take us into the process of what it took to get to those changes.
Well, let me say that, as you know, the March on Washington was the sum total of many individuals committed to making change. A. Philip Randolph, the conceptualizer of the march, Bayard Rustin, who helped organize it, put it together, was so key. But even, organizations like the United Auto Workers, Walter Reuther. Walter paid for the buses that brought people into Washington, D.C. for the march. And there were many others that made significant contributions. So collective effort was a key area of change. Certainly, there are examples that we live with today where we sort of take for granted the process, and yet it is clear it took a lot of time. An example, the Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Today we sort of take for granted, even though there is a proliferation of hate crime activity taking place in the country today, but we take for granted that persons in the United States, regardless of their citizenship status, should be free from violence directed at their person because of their race or their gender or their sexual orientation. We take that for granted. But when the Leadership Conference did its first report in 1996, called Cause for Concern, Hate Crimes in America, we asked for a White House conference. We got a White House conference. We thought passage of the legislation was just behind the corner, around the corner. In 1998, Matthew Shepard and James Byrd were killed. The bills were named after them. And yet it took us until 2009 to pass a bill to get President Obama to sign it, because we had the audacity to include the LGBTQ community. The transgendered were the primary objection, but we take that sort of for granted now. What I'm suggesting is that, indeed, social change does not move in a linear fashion. It moves in fits and starts. I certainly recognize that, we have to mobilize an effort. Coalition is absolutely necessary. It's essential to making change in the way that we talk about. And it has to be both at the local level as well as at the national level. You've got to be able to do both. And so those elements are sort of the key factors, among others, in building a system that helps change occur. And we sort of take for granted the elements of change, which include, for example, having a campaign. Narrative is absolutely vital. You've got to have a compelling narrative in order to drive change, and it has to be powerful, and it has to touch people where they live. And that certainly exists in the context of the child welfare question.
Seizing on the Matthew Shepard, I think it was 9 Congresses that it took to get the bill get the bill passed. What were some of the elements of some of the early elements that persisted, some of the key insights, whether they were about narrative or about partnership, and then what were some of the pivots that ended up being essential? And if you're willing, what were some of the wrenching pivots? What were some of the rancorous pivots that were key to getting across the finish line?
It's very interesting, because when we started out, race did not turn out to be the significant factor in opposition that we thought it might be. Members of Congress largely accepted the notion that African Americans had been victimized by hate crimes and that we needed to strengthen federal law to protect them. That was not a problem. Extending the coverage to the Latino community and the Asian community wasn't a particular problem. It was the LGBT community that posed the significant threat. Congress had homophobic elements that made it difficult to accept the fact that the LGBTQ community was as much entitled to protection as anyone else. And so for years, we had to go through this process of demonstrating in, significant ways that the broader community was affected by this and deserved the right to be protected. Now, we had, for the most part, allies who helped carry the water for us. But, there are times when you are called upon to make a choice. And as I said, we should not be, we should be conscious of the aphorism of Voltaire. Don't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. We should be aware of that. And there are times when you are encouraged to make a deal and it's the right deal to take. But there are other times when you have to stand up for principle. And on the hate crimes bill, we stood up for principle. We said, look, we'll live with the existing law for now, but we can't accept a deal that excludes the LGBT community and call that a victory for the civil rights community. You've got to measure civil and human rights by a single yardstick. And you can't have one group, obviously affected in the same way that others are, left on the sidelines. That's unacceptable. So we had some friends and some, people who questioned from time to time whether we should do that. One surprising character whom we love dearly and who largely carried our water on most issues, Barney Frank, suggested at one point, well, maybe this isn't such a bad deal. Accept it now with the understanding that the LGB community would be covered, but not the T. We'll leave the transgender out for another day. And eventually he came around. He accepted the fact that that's unacceptable, and he led the charge to get the entire community covered. But surprises. Those were surprises. And when the bill was signed into law by President Obama, it was a huge victory for the civil rights community, and we shared in its success.
So let's talk about a deal that many see as watershed, and that many have criticized on the issue of sentencing reform, because that's the story of how we got there. So, we don't have sort of video capability, but Wade showed me a clip last night of a fairly jocular exchange between him and Senator Jeff Sessions, who that the leadership conference had been no friend to for many years. But talk a little bit about the journey to sentencing reform, and then what the controversy over the final deal was, and how and what we can learn from that.
Well, the journey really began with the 1986 crime bill. President Obama, then a senator, was one of the leaders in advocating the crime bill, and it was the crime bill that helped to set up the dichotomy between crack cocaine and powder cocaine and the differentiation in the sentencing. Now, from the outset, people knew that it was unjust. The two drugs are pharmacologically almost the same. The idea that you would sentence one at 100-to-1 ratio and compare to the other was largely a reflection of culture and race and other considerations, not so much the reality of what people faced. Fast forward. We began challenging that issue in earnest around 1994. In 1995, the U.S. Sentencing Commission issued a report recommending that the drugs be treated the same and that there be a 1-to-1 recommendation. That effort was largely overturned with the assistance of Bill Clinton, but also led in the House by a Republican congressman from Florida, Bill McCollum. We were horrified. Now, the one missed opportunity that is worth noting is the fact that the day that bill was voted on in the House to overturn the recommendation of the Sentencing Commission, the Million Man March took place in Washington, D.C. There were 1 million black men in Washington on the grounds of the mall, the Congressional Mall. And if half of 1% of them had come to the Capitol and sat simply in the rows in the Capitol, that bill would probably never have been passed. But it was a missed opportunity to redirect some of that energy to where it could make a difference. So nothing happened for about 15 years when we finally were able to convince Dick Durbin, who led the effort from the very outset, deserves much credit. He is the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. From the very outset, he was a champion on these issues. Jeff Sessions came to it late, but at the same time he came to it at all was a positive statement of local advocacy plus engaged outreach at the federal level. And it was Jeff Sessions and Dick Durbin who together, along with House leadership like Maxine Waters and Bobby Scott and others, who helped break the change. But at the end of the day, it was the bipartisan agreement between Sessions and Durbin that made the difference. One of the lessons that you take away from this is that change at the congressional level requires bipartisanship. You can't, notwithstanding what may be the apparent toxicity of Congress today, you can't make significant change, lasting change, without a serious bipartisan effort. Now, that may change in the future, but right now, that is still the rule.
The leadership conference had been more than a fly in the ointment for Jeff. I mean, at some point, you couldn't have blamed him for taking it personally.
No, that's right.
You blocked appointments to the to judgeships for him. You got in his way all the time for principled reasons.
Yes.
What helped you to work? What allowed you to work together on this issue in such an effective way?
That's a good question. First, it had to do with the state law in Alabama. The state law in Alabama at the time mirrored more of what we were trying to accomplish at the federal level than one might have expected. It did not have the same degree of penalty between crack and powder cocaine. And Sessions had been a local prosecutor, a U.S. attorney, and he understood that. And in fairness to him, he appreciated the significance of that local role. Secondly, we had the Southern Poverty Law Center and several groups in Alabama, including Republican state leaders who thought that the cost of incarceration of so many people under the federal law was a burden to the state and not particularly helpful. So we had some local leadership in support of what we were trying to accomplish. Third, Sessions said, look, I'm not going to do a one-to-one reduction. I'm not going to do that. I'll reduce it from 100 to 1 down to 18 to 1. How he chose that number, who knows? But it was really largely him putting his imprint on the bill and saying, that's the cost of my doing business. And we supported that effort. And we said, look, we'll take it. We appreciate it. You know, it helps move the ball forward. We will take it. And he agreed to do that. And we had, for a time, a very positive relationship, as you look, surprising, guys.
For a few minutes anyway.
Yeah,
for a few
minutes.
Something, so I want to ask about how people responded to the deal that you made. Something you taught me, well, I guess I didn't disclose. Wade and I've had the great fortune of getting to work with Wade. He was a reference for me in getting this job. So Doris Duke staff, if you have complaints, this is your chance. But one of the things I remember you saying in a similar conversation we had after the Shelby County decision, when there was a brief moment where there was the possibility of having a bill drafted in committee, and the people around the table, some people around the table were arguing in earnest, any deal is complicity.
Yes.
And injustice. And I remember you saying, just be careful, there's no controlled use of nuclear weapons, which is something there's always unintended consequences when you use nuclear weapons. How were you able to convince people to take the deal? And has the appraisal of the deal changed over time? Were some of those who said this is wrong, have they come around? Or yes. I mean, I'd just love to hear about.
Let me answer the second question first. The appraisal of the deal has changed. A number of organizations are thrilled that we have some progress made on reducing the disparity between crack and powder cocaine. It has affected thousands of people who might otherwise be incarcerated. The agreement was largely born of a left-right coalition. Koch brothers and others ended up supporting an effort that we in the progressive community had largely led. But there were many who, from both sides of the aisle, came together to support it. Now, in the beginning, that was not true. There were many who held out for the better deal, who argued that, look, any compromise is a concession to principle. You shouldn't make it. Don't take it. We oppose it. Look, at some point, leadership requires you to make a decision, even one that is unpopular. And sometimes you make the decision recognizing that, look, there may be people who ultimately ask for your head. That may be the price you pay for making a decision that goes against the grain. But that price is worth it if you feel committed to the change that you're trying to accomplish. And you have to do it. Mike Johnson, the current Speaker of the House, is faced with a similar challenge regarding funding for Ukraine. He has been told that if he moves that forward, it will cost him his speakership. Well, the truth is, if he feels the principle is sufficiently important, he'll do what he knows is the right thing to do. But, we'll have to see. So, yes, it did have a positive effect at the end of the day, but it took time for people to accept that. And that price has come up in other instances as well.
Yeah, there's something else in the story on sentencing reform that it feels really apt to me about some of the discussions that we're having, which is, sometimes the political imagination or the political configuration or both are just unable to conceive of a different way. But that doesn't mean that the power of a rationally derived truth is wasted. And so if, like, for example, so Clinton, the Clinton administration had made a clear calculation that they were going to run to the right on crime and to the right on cash assistance in order to run to the left on other issues. Right. And nothing was going to change that. I mean, this is the era of welfare reform. This is the era of the super predator, so to speak. Sure. But the power of the Sentencing Commission putting a rationally derived recommendation out there that could sort of sit as a kind of gadfly. I mean, one of the conversations we have so often about things like research in some of the tables I sit on is like, we don't just want it to sit on a shelf. And I think, well, sometimes I do want it to sit on a shelf. I want the right thing to be sitting on that shelf staring at us so that when the stars realign and there's a different set of imperatives, there's a different set of possibilities, you've actually got the evidence base. Yes. You've actually got the recommendations. And I think about even, David's powerful closing about, look, we haven't even imagined a better system. So what have been some of the really important moves, research, marker bills, campaigns that maybe weren't heralded at the moment, that maybe would have been judged as failures in the short term, but actually in the long marathon, played a critical role in getting us off the blocks? Can you sort of think of in the campaigns you've been involved in key decisions, key opportunities that only realize their value later?
Well, I can give you one example, although it remains a disappointment and a failure. And that is around the issue of D.C. statehood. I know it's an obscure question. Most people don't think about D.C. as being a state. I got it. There's 700,000 citizens in the nation's capital that do not have a vote for a member of Congress, either senator or the House. Eleanor Norton is a delegate. She's not a representative. She does not have a vote when it matters. And so this question of how do you provide representation for 700,000 U.S. citizens who today don't have it? There was an opportunity that presented itself led by a Republican congressman from Virginia, Tom Davis. We had an anomaly in the census of 2000, and Utah was about to get a seat. And the question was, should Utah come into the Republic with an additional seat when in fact that seat was derived from, the counting of people who worked overseas as missionaries and others? And how do you sort of handle that? Well, he devised an idea, along with several others of us, to say, why don't you bring D.C. in as the corresponding state? D.C. comes in as a Democratic state. Utah is, of course, Republican. The balance of power is maintained. You expand the House by 2 seats for a short time to 437. And if we can get President W. Bush to sign it, wouldn't that be a victory? Because you would have at least a vote in the House. The purists refused. At the end of the day, Congresswoman Norton said no. She turned it down, even though there was a good chance that W would sign the bill. We had Jack Kemp supporting it. We had a host of others who were behind it. Powerful Republicans, Michael Steele, who had not yet become head of the party, was behind it. We had a chance. They turned it down. Today, we don't have any representation beyond what we had back in the early 2000s when that came up. It was a huge disappointment. It was not knowing when to take a deal when it was presented. And the evidence was there that we should consider it. It was a missed opportunity. Situations like that do occur, guys. Situations like that do occur. And we have to be sensitive about how and when to make the deal, if we should, and sort of how do you recognize when the change that is presented to you is sufficiently meaningful for you to take the proposal seriously. And that's a challenge.
I was thinking about, we were talking last night about this. I sort of, one example we talked about and then one we didn't, that both sort of speak to the power of an idea. One is, out of the failed Hillary Clinton healthcare effort in the early 90s, the individual mandate idea did become the intellectual center of the healthcare reform debate. And I think, it was clear from the ACA debate, there still isn't a robust movement for a kind of a public option national single payer plan. So having an idea that could sort of work within an America. And then the other one that sort of came to mind is cap and trade, like the idea that we really need to put a price on carbon. Now, it's evolved, and we may not have acted quickly enough on the idea, but you can change the center of gravity on an issue in a way that becomes important over time. I want to ask about some of your impressions of this set of issues, but before I do, a little bit of reflection on this moment. I think if most Americans, if we did an exercise and said, everyone, close your eyes and come up with a visual metaphor for federal politics today, it wouldn't be like this background, or whatever. It would be sort of like a Hieronymus Bosch painting or something, probably. But what do you think about the moment we're in now, and whether does that change? Does that cause you to rethink some of what you thought you learned over your time? Would you have different principles for today, or would you apply the same principles in a different way?
I may be a little too rigid in my thinking, but I would apply the same set of principles today as I would have applied years ago. And in part, I'll tell you why. Look at the child tax credit, guys. We are potentially about to pass a child tax credit that provides $2,000 per year to the poorest individuals that we've got, and it has bipartisan support. There was a child tax credit in President Biden's early implementation that proved to be wildly successful. The topic of child welfare is often overshadowed by the reality of poverty. The child welfare issue is a function of poverty. I'm no expert in the field, obviously, and I'm approaching this with a lot of humility. But from what I've read and seen, and I want to thank you, Lisa, for Kids Count, I used that data set to help prepare for this presentation. It is very clear that poverty is a reality. And so the child tax credit makes a significant difference. And even with the toxicity in Congress today, we may yet get that provision enacted into law. I think that there are examples like that which show that this is a propitious moment for making change. Propitious moment. Now, I will say the one thing I didn't hear in the conversations we had earlier, and I thought they were rich and significant, was the role of the federal government and the legislation that already exists. I understand foundations are precluded from legislative advocacy for the most part. Your C3 entities, you're not going to be able to engage in advocacy. I got it. But there are clear examples where advocacy can be helpful. And our job is to think through how we get around limitations that prevent us from making change to address issues that are. I read an article before I came here from NPR about how some states require parents to repay the cost of foster care as the price for gaining access to their children once again. And they highlighted a woman in Minnesota who had 3 kids, and her kids had been taken into foster care, and when she got them back, she had a $20,000 bill from the state. And there are other examples like that exist. And there is an existing statute, and I've got the name of it written down, that in effect requires that. Could be changed by regulation. Doesn't even require a new law to be passed. but it does require focused attention and action. And somewhere we need to think about that. There is one statute that takes away a child's takes away a parental right. In foster care, you can't, if you don't react or get the child back in 15 months within the 22 months that have previous 22 months, you may lose parental rights. That's outrageous, and the impact is significant. What I'm suggesting, colleagues, is that, look, I know that there are limitations in what you can do. And what I heard in the room was really promising in terms of all the flowers that are blooming at the foundations. But there are certain provisions in which there is perhaps consensus, a rule for change, and maybe we should think through, in addition to what has been discussed, how we address those issues as short-term solutions to a longer problem that involves the kind and deeper work that you're doing now.
That question that question is sort of, how do you move at two speeds? How do you think about the long term from a principled point of view, and then effectively and rigorously assess the opportunities in front of you, some of which may move the needle, some of which may not.
Right.
But this observation with the child tax credit, I really do think is powerful. We really are making almost a round trip from the 1996 really bipartisan consensus, philosophical consensus behind welfare reform, that this is all about personal responsibility and we don't want to disincentivize people taking personal responsibility. And that round trip isn't just that suddenly people are penetrated by the white hot light of reason. The round trip is partly that there's a populist insurgency in both parties that says these institutions aren't working on their own terms, but also we reject the goal. In 1996, we thought, let's globalize a free market and everyone's going to move up. And we now recognize that all that's done is contribute to yawning inequality. And I think it seems to me it's led certainly some constituencies who have traditionally been Democratic, some constituencies who've been traditionally Republican, to see themselves as structurally dislocated from the economy. And if you can understand yourself as structurally dislocated from the economy, it's not that helpful to hear people tell you should take personal responsibility
for
your
own
success.
Absolutely right. No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think some of the institutions on both sides of that conversation are now helping to lead the charge for reform. Look, colleagues, we would not possibly get a child tax credit enacted given the attitude that we know exists between Republicans and Democrats on most issues. The fact that this is possibly happening is the result of lots of hours of investment and argument at the state and local level. Don't forget the power of state and local advocacy. You heard some of that in the room this morning with our friends from Hawaii. That power is significant, but we need to harness it. We need to have it written about in creative and thoughtful ways that help to change the needle. I'm looking for a report that, is something hidden in plain sight. Barriers to effective child welfare reform, that really does a national survey and that helps to really document what is happening and becomes a rallying cry. I'm expecting a White House conference on child welfare reform. President Biden, assuming he is reelected, would do that. I can't speak about a President Trump, I don't know. But I would say that regardless of who is there, you want to push for it. Even if you don't get it, it helps to elevate the visibility of the issue in a way that allows us to control the narrative about the change that's needed.
Well, Wade, one of the words we learned earlier today was kapuna, which is sort of an elder who transmits wisdom. You have been a great kapuna to me, and I just want to thank you for sharing your wisdom with this group. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.